Hi, everyone. Welcome to our tips and tricks session today. We're really excited to have our VP of Solutions Engineering, Rich Severson. He's going to be taking us through no-touch build versions, updates, the taxonomy, the naming, so we can understand all of that better. We will be taking some questions throughout. We will definitely make time at the end for additional questions, so feel free to add questions in the Q&A. That's the easiest spot for us to see the questions, but we'll also be monitoring the chat and make sure that we're answering as many as we can from there as well. So without further ado, let's get started, Rich.
Yeah, well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. This is number 2 in a series of Stratodesk tips and tricks. Today, as Danielle pointed out, we're going to cover the image taxonomy. We're going to talk about updating the virtual appliance. We're also going to talk about updating the devices. So many of you that I see that are attending, you probably already know some of this. That you may get some tips and tricks out of this. And the next one we'll probably do probably next month we will cover connections and extensions. So like I said, so those are the things we're going to go ahead and cover today. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. Danielle, if you would just give me a quick confirmation that everybody can still see my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so like I said, so today we're going to talk about what's called image taxonomy, because a lot of times people ask us, what is the build numbers? How does that come about? How do you number these things? How does it make sense? So I want to make sure that we cover those kinds of things so that people understand. So if when you get a chance, obviously some of you may already have Stratodesk images, you may have them in your NoTouch Center, you may have them on your devices, etc. But when you go into the customer portal to download them, how do you know which one to download, etc.? So first of all, as you can see on the screen, I'm in our KB site. So you can always go to our KB site, just go to kb.stratodesk.com. And in this case, I've actually did a search for taxonomy, and you can see that's where it's taken us. So what we're going to do is we're just going to cover real quick what these mean and why it's important to understand, okay? So if you will, when you look at our images, like here, you see LNX 3.3.203, okay? So those are the image build numbers, and those are a running build number. And currently we're at, not in the customer portal, but for the employees, we're at 3.5.206. So the next GA build will be 3.5.2 plus, if you will, right? So that's an incremental build number, and that will always increase. So if you're wondering what build number you're using, it's the first, I guess, if you will, the first 1, 2, 3, the first 7 characters. That's really important to us. The next part in the middle is always a letter designation. In this case, you see it says EES. And what that stands for is that stands for Enterprise Edition Standard. Now, there are a couple of different variations for those. There's such as EEA, as you see here, for Enterprise Edition for Amazon Workspaces. There's EEF for Nutanix Frame. There's also EEM, which is the Multimedia Edition for, it includes additional codecs. And then for the military people, we actually have a DoD build as well that happens to include the additional security features such as 90 meter, okay? The next is the K, or the kernel numbers, okay? And we'll go into that, and I'll come back to that. Complex, and a lot of people ask about those. So, and then of course, after that is the architecture that refers to the bit architecture is an x64, x86, or ARM HF. Most people today will be using the x64 images. The ARM HF, those are for the Raspberry Pi based devices. Okay. So after that, then you'll see the file extensions. We have a .lfi or a .zip file. Most people, when you're getting first introduced to Stratodesk, you will receive a .zip file. And that .zip file, what that does is that's what allows you to build the USB devices to install NoTouch OS from USB or to create the live boot drives, okay? So, and then LFI is, those are the files that will be used to update an existing Stratodesk device, okay? So just remember, LFI is used for updating something that's already running NoTouch OS, okay? It is important to understand, though, if you are doing Pixie boot with your NoTouch Center, you will actually have to include both files, or both file types, the .lfi file and the .zip files for the Pixie server for the Pixie boot to work correctly,
Okay, so that's just a quick introduction about the files and the builds. Now let's talk a little bit more about the kernel versions. We get asked a lot about how do I know which kernel to use? And currently our reference is to start with the K515. That's as of Q4 23, right? And what that is that is what allows us to have multiple kernel level support for multiple different platforms of devices, and yet still have the most current releases of code. What that means is potentially you could have a laptop from, say, 7, 8 years ago that may need to use, let's say, K510, because the wireless drivers for that specific laptop may be included in that kernel, but they may have been deprecated in like the K600 series, which is typically for the Surfaces. Now, we often get asked, is there an easy way to know? And quite honestly, unfortunately, no, because what we do is we go with the kernel standards, and we include the drivers that maintain across the kernel, the open source kernel systems. Okay, so again, right now we tell everybody start with K515. If you're having an issue with a wireless driver or a hard driver, those types of things, recognizing specific hardware, let us know. Reach out to the support team. We may have a recommendation for you. You may have to go back a version to, say, a K510, or if you're using the latest NUCs or the latest Surfaces, you may need to use a K600 series. So hopefully that helps a little bit. There is obviously information about what drivers are included and what kernels out on the internet. You can search those, but honestly, it's easier just to go ahead and send a note to our support team, and we'll be able to answer those for you. Okay. So that's that regarding the image build numbers. Hopefully that helps. Hopefully that clarifies that type of information should anybody have any questions. And again, you can get that information at kb.stratodesk.com. And if you search for taxonomy, you'll find this link in the KB site. Okay. So with that, we're going to jump to the next subject. And the next subject is about updating the virtual appliance. And I should point out, first of all, how do you get to the virtual appliance, right? So you can get to the virtual appliance 2 ways. Most of you know what the standard URL is for your NoTouch Center. When you get to the login page for your NoTouch Center, at the bottom, there's actually a link that says virtual appliance, and you can click on that, and that'll take you to the page that you see here, okay? Or as I always do, just because I do it so often, is I just put in the URL for my virtual appliance and then put in va-admin, and it'll take me right to this page. With that, this is where we do the updates for the virtual appliance itself for NoTouch Center, okay? And in here, there's 3 different sections that are important for the updates. So the first one, and I tell people, you know, what you want to do is you want to check this periodically, and you want to do these in order if you have multiple places where they're out of date, right? So the first thing you want to do is you want to start with the virtual appliance software. And what this is, if you think about it, right, effectively the NoTouch Center VA, or the OVA file, has an underlying Ubuntu operating system, which is this one here. And then there's the virtual appliance container that runs the application. And then the application is NoTouch Center itself, okay? So for the VA, you can always just go in and you can click check now. And what it'll do is it'll check against our repository. And if there's any updates available, it'll come up and it'll show you what build that is, and it'll give you the option to install. I also recommend to people, if you haven't done it in quite a while and you go and you'll notice potentially that there may be 2 or 3 of those updates that show available to you, always go in incremental order, just because, you know, you want to make sure that the updates are going to go through smoothly. I don't foresee any issues, but, you know, again, it's always wise to do those updates in incremental order. The next one is NoTouch Center. And so let's talk about what NoTouch Center is. Again, this is the application that you see when you're managing the endpoint devices, okay? And what those updates do, those updates are what update the parameters, the configuration options, et cetera, that you see in NoTouch Center when you're managing devices. So when we add a new feature, when we add a new parameter, when we add a new application or extension, in order to see those updates, to be able to make those configuration changes, that's where those updates are made. Those are made inside the NoTouch Center updates. It's also important to understand that this is the only update that does require that you have maintenance and subscription, okay? Because this is where you log into the customer portal and retrieve the .deb files to perform those updates, Okay, and again, you can always just connect to the customer portal, and once you log in, you'll be able to see those. If you are having problems logging into the customer portal, please reach out to your partner or to your Stratodesk account representative, and we can get that worked out for you. Okay, after that, then the underlying operating system, and you can click and start the update process here. And again, this updates the underlying operating system, and this checks against the public Ubuntu repositories. It's also important to note that you can get any of these updates. Well, actually, I should say you can get 2 of the updates directly from the customer portal. If for whatever reason, let's say your NoTouch Center is in a dark data center where you don't have public connectivity, so you can log into the customer portal and get those. You can also get the OS, the underlying Ubuntu OS, from the public Ubuntu repositories and pull those down and apply those locally as well. So hopefully that helps understanding the updating of the virtual appliance. And as I mentioned earlier, when you're doing Pixie, this is where you have to be able to provide both the zip file and the LFI file to be able to do Pixie correctly. Okay, so
Hey,
hopefully that
Rich.
helps. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, we do have a question about what you're talking about just before this. So someone mentioned half our systems are air-gapped. Do I need to build a Linux repository to update the OS?
You do not need to build a Linux repository, but you can actually retrieve them to a local file store and then be able to point to the local file store to be able to get to them. Okay, and usually I believe the offline, it's called, if you do search, last time I did it, I believe it's called offline update, and you'll be able to retrieve those files in a package and be able to apply it. Okay.
Okay, great. We have one more. Do you recommend to update the OS first and then do package updates for the virtual appliance and NoTouch Center?
I always tell people for the updates to do them in the order that they're listed under the update sections. So start with the virtual appliance. Make sure you do all the updates, everything's applied. Do you have to do reboots in between? No, but again, it depends on your environment and what you're doing and when was the last time you've done those updates, okay? Then do the NoTouch Center updates, and then again, do the underlying operating system updates after it. I always do them in order, and I've been doing this with Stratodesk for 6+ years now, and I've never had any issues doing them in that order. So hopefully that helps. So, okay. Any other questions? So, all
Okay,
right.
that's it for now. Yep.
All right. So, and again, like I said, don't forget, you can get those updates by logging into the customer portal, and you can, of course, can get to the customer portal going to the stratodesk.com to the website. Okay. With that, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump over to NoTouch Center, and I'm going to bet it's been a bit, so I'm probably timed out. So let me log back in. Okay, and when it comes to updating the devices, obviously there's multiple ways that you can do those, and it's going to be dependent somewhat on what your group structure is, what your deployment environment is. Do you have multiple time zones? Do you have multiple devices spread across different regions, et cetera, those kinds of things. So the things that I like to point out to people that when you're doing the updates for the devices is, number one, if you do have multiple time zones, multiple regions, those kinds of things, this field called firmware pool, okay? What that is think about, so just as an example, I'm located in Nashville, Tennessee. If I was updating devices that are here on my network, I would just leave it and use the standard NoTouch Center virtual appliance as the file store to update my devices. Now, if I had a remote office, let's say I had a remote location in Australia, and obviously, and let's say that I had, 100, 500, 5,000 devices over there. I probably wouldn't want to pull those firmware packages for 500 devices all the way across the ocean. So what you can do is you can use the firmware pool, and you can use a web service, right? It could be a website, a web service. It could be an AWS or Google Drive or something like that, where you can upload the image to that location and then use that URL. So when the devices execute their update process, instead of reaching all the way back to the data center, to my data center here in Tennessee, they would actually pull them from the quote unquote local specified firmware pool URL. Okay. So, and by the way, that also helps if you have those larger environments where you have, 15, 25, 50,000 devices, and you have a short window that you need to be able to update, you can provide multiple URLs. That way you're not going to flood any specific network and be able to get those files distributed quickly. Okay. So now with that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to scroll down to the update section. And in the update section, the first thing that I like to cover with people is what's called a concurrent update limit. And by default, that is set to 0. And what 0 means is it's unrestricted or unlimited. If I have 5,000 devices and I say update at reboot, and I reboot 5,000 devices, I'm going to start 5,000 threads updating devices, which you probably don't want to do, but you have the ability to do that. So in here, concurrent update limit, think of that as let's say that I'm working with a small remote office that may have 10 devices. With that being a small remote location with only 10 devices, I probably don't want to update all 10 at once. So I may want to set that to 3. I may want to set it to 5. And then it's important to understand how that actually works. So as an example, if I were to set the concurrent update limit to 3, meaning that there are 3 available update threads, and I say update at reboot, and I reboot all of those devices, what will happen is all those devices that will, all 10 devices would reboot. Only the first 3 would begin the update process because the concurrent thread limit is set to 3. That means I would have 7 devices that wouldn't get updated in that case until they reboot again. So that's where people would then typically use the announce update at announce. So it's important to understand that if we say updated announce, again, the announce cycle for most devices, unless you right click and say announce to the whole group at one time, is going to be a random, right? Because the announce cycle is going to be based on the boot time of the device, plus, give or take a few seconds of, random number generation so that you don't have a flood of devices. So if I have 10 devices that are set to an update at announce, what it'll do is as those devices begin to announce in and the available threads are there, those devices will begin the update process. It's important to understand about that. So again, 10 devices with a concurrent update limit of 3. And let's say I have device 1 announces and it begins the update process. Then device 2 announces and it begins the update process. Then let's say device 5. So now we're out of order, right? We got 1, 2, and 5. So 5 announces and it begins the update process. So now, 30 seconds later, device 4 doesn't announce and it looks and there's not a concurrent update thread available. Device 4 will not begin the update process and it will hold until its next announce cycle, okay? It won't begin when the thread's available. It'll begin on its next announce cycle, assuming that there's a concurrent thread available for that update process. I hope everybody understands that and that's clear. So,
Hey, Rich, we do have a question.
Yep.
So is in regards to the firmware pools. They're asking if the LFI files were copied to a working device, will all the other devices update from that one device?
There is an option to do that. Absolutely. You can set it up where you can do, and I forget the exact terminology that we call it, but it's the LFI sharing, right? So you can set up where you can designate a quote unquote host device in that location, and that host device will then be used as the update thread or the update firmware pool. It's there, it's available. Most people don't use it simply because in that case, then what you're doing is you're asking quote unquote a thin client to be the host for those update threads. So in that case, if I was going to do that, I would probably set the concurrent update limit to 1. That way you're not going to flood that one device or make that one device unusable while it's updating the other devices that are local to it. So I hope that helps.
And
okay.
Rich, thanks for that. And so you can ask another question to follow up if that didn't answer your question. We have a second question, and this is rewinding back a little bit in regards to updating NoTouch Center. Someone was asking if they're using Cloud Extension, should they also take advantage and update Extension at the same time as they do NTC?
Yes, thank you. That's actually a fantastic question. Now, it's important to understand that on the Cloud Extension, the NoTouch Center application is not being used. So in that case, for the Cloud Extension, you'll only need to do the virtual appliance updates and the underlying OS updates. Okay, so because again, if you think about it, when you put the NoTouch Center virtual appliance into cloud extension mode, the NoTouch Center application is not actually being used. Okay.
Thanks, Rich.
Okay, so if there's no more questions, let's go ahead and roll through. So again, now the next part of this, right, where we have image version, image class, image kernel, image architecture, most people don't use those options. And in most cases, you probably don't, but or won't need to. But the nice thing is that these options are available. And the reason that these are available and what they do for you, imagine in this group called Playground, let's say that I have different architecture. Let's say that I have Raspberry-based or Raspberry Pi devices, and I have traditional thin clients. So I've got x64. I may have some 32-bit devices. And I have some Raspberry Pi devices in the same group. If I were to go ahead and select Image OS, and I choose the x64 architecture, that's not going to update my 32-bit devices. That's not going to update my Raspberry Pi devices. So rather than use that option, what I would do in that case is I would just go ahead and select image version. And you notice here, it just says 35206. So as long as I have 35206 ARM, I have 35206 K412 for the 32-bit, and I have the x64 for the 64-bit devices. NoTouch Center is smart enough, it will apply the appropriate image to the appropriate architecture. So that way I don't have to go out and break out the different groups based on different architecture. I can just say that I want all the devices that are part of this group to have 35206. And as long as those correct image files are available as part of the NoTouch Center file store or the file repositories, if you're using remote repositories, those devices will automatically retrieve the correct versions. Okay, so hopefully that helps. And of course, you can do the same thing with image class. You may have devices that are using EEM versus EES, etc., and it'll apply the appropriate versions to the appropriate devices. Okay. Next, I like to go through and point out the day limitations. This is where you can set date restrictions or day restrictions. So let's say that you have maintenance windows on each day. So I can say I want to do updates, but I want to limit the updates, to occur between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. So you can set those restrictions. You may have a situation where your update window may only be on Thursdays. So you can say, hey, I want to allow devices to update only on Thursday from 11:30 p.m. to let's say 6 a.m. right? Let's say, here we go, 2 a.m. So let's say that that's my maintenance window. And so I can say that I want the devices to update at announce, but only in that maintenance window on Thursdays, right? In this case, you see I happen to have Thursdays and Saturdays set. But I hope that gives you an idea of how you can use the restrictions within those date parameters to set maintenance windows or update windows for your devices. Okay. Now, likewise, I could go ahead and I could set this up and say, hey, I want to do this. Let's pre-stage it per se, meaning in this case, I want to do those updates. I want to do it in the maintenance windows for Thursdays and Saturdays unannounced, but I don't want those updates to begin until let's go December 25th. We'll say Christmas Day. So now I've got those parameters set. I've got those maintenance windows set. And I've also got it set where it's not going to begin that process until December 25th. Okay.
Hey, Rich,
So,
is that local time or is that the server's time?
that is, let me think about this. Sorry. That is going to be based on the time of the device when the device does the announce. Because remember, we're saying at announce. Right? So what's going to happen is the device is going to announce and it's going to check in. Okay. Next thing that I like to point out in here is, where is it? The idle time window. And for some reason, my instance is not showing the idle time window. Anyways, in your NoTouch Center, sorry, I apologize. My instance right now is not showing it. In these parameters, you'll also see a device idle time where you can go ahead and set, and that's in seconds. So you can say that I want all these to occur, but I want the devices to be idle for, typically we use the example of 600 seconds, which would be 5 minutes. Okay. Let me go back in and see if I can get that refresh so that it's showing you. But anyways, the idle timer will check to see that way the device has to be idle for, there it is, right there, minimum user idle time. So if that way, if the user is using the machine, it won't be eligible for that update process and it'll skip through until the next announce cycle. Okay, so hopefully that helps, gives you the idea of how you can use the different parameters within NoTouch Center to be able to do those. Now I'm going
Thanks,
to point out
Rich.
to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, while we're on this page, so where it says no update from and no update to, wouldn't that be the window you want to exclude updates since it says no update?
Yes, that is correct. And I used the wrong verbiage for that as I was talking about it. I said that. But yes, that is setting the no update windows. Correct.
Okay, thank you.
The premise is the same. I just verbalized it incorrectly backwards. But yes, you are correct. It is the no update windows. Okay. So thank you for pointing that out. The other thing too that I like to point out when we're talking about doing updates and using the scheduler for updates, because we have had instances where people have inadvertently scheduled updates and they didn't want those updates to go through. If you go to the global settings, to the gears, and you scroll down to the area called Floodgates. And I just like to point this out just because a lot of people don't realize what this is and why it's here. So we're going to scroll down until we get to Floodgates. And here we are. Okay, and what these floodgates are these are the different protocols and ports within NoTouch Center that manage the announce and the firmware updates for the devices and the communications between NoTouch Center and the endpoints. And the reason that that's important is if, let's say that you inadvertently scheduled an update, and we've actually had this happen, where somebody inadvertently scheduled an update to occur. They tried to schedule it to occur in the future, and what they did is they actually scheduled it to occur immediately. And so in those cases, what you can do, and what I would do in that case, is you can go in and say, allow get firmware URL and turn that off, okay? Now, it's important to understand what that's actually going to do, right? The devices, if you schedule them to update now and they begin the update process at announce, they're going to check in and check to see if there is a firmware update for them. So that's not going to stop. In this case, if we just do the allow get firmware. If I turn off the allow get firmware, what that's going to do is that's going to remove the URL, if you will, temporarily from the file store. So the devices are going to announce, they're going to check in and they're going to look for that URL. That URL is not going to be available. What's going to happen is the update process would fail because the URL is not available. The device would just reboot and go on about its way. Okay. So think about these are almost emergency action buttons, if you will, to turn off communications, disconnect things, disconnect the firmware URL, those types of things, to allow you to go back and then adjust those parameters so you can get them within the right times. So again, these are floodgate controls. They control the communications between the endpoints and NoTouch Center and give you different options to be able to control those updates. Okay.
Hey,
With
Rich,
that, yep,
well,
go ahead.
while you pause, while you pause for a sec, I got a question for you. Is there a way to force any active connections to close before scheduled updates are applied?
So is there an option to close any active connections before an update occurs? No, you don't necessarily need to close the connection. As example, like let's say that you've got a device in kiosk mode, so you probably wouldn't want to do that, right? But there's some different methods that you can go about that, right? You could say action after exit, do a reboot. So you could schedule the updates to occur at reboot time. That way, if I'm in an active session, whether it be Citrix, VMware, or what have you, and then I close out that connection, if the action after exit is set to reboot, that device would reboot, then the update process would begin. But if you're talking about doing it while there's an active connection, per se, again, we're talking about, does the idle timer going to kick in? It's not going to, if you've got it set so the idle timer is not there, it's not going to interfere with an active user session, okay? But you can say that if you don't set the idle time and you say at announce, it would disconnect the session. But again, it's important to understand that if the host session, meaning the Citrix, the VMware RDP session, what have you, is set to reconnect, the device would begin its update process. And if you have it to automatically start that connection, then it would just resume its connection. So it's all going to be dependent on the different parameters for the host session and what the client connection parameters are set for. Is it set for action after exit? Is it set to automatically start at reboot? Those different parameters get weighed into those behaviors. So it is, I mean, those are all good questions, and it's important because those all impact on how you do your update processes. Okay.
Thanks, Rich. We do have another one. What is the best practice for updating a single or small number of devices to ensure everything is working correctly before pushing out updates to all?
So, certainly I would recommend everybody always test an update process and test the latest update in your environment to make sure that everything's working before you push it out to devices. Most organizations usually have a test lab, whether that be a local lab or a remote lab. I would always test those updates, and you should, right? I mean, as most of you are aware, because of what we do with Stratodesk with NoTouch OS, there's so many different variations of hosts, host connections, host connection parameters. It's virtually impossible for us to test every possible environment, every possible scenario. We go through obviously the QA testing we do for the main principles and the main ideas. So yeah, so always, if you have the ability, test on 1 or 2 devices before you push those out. A lot of organizations that I know have quote unquote a test group of users where they have, let's say a group of people maybe in each business unit, whether it be somebody in accounting, somebody in the call center, et cetera, where those are the test users, where they say, hey, we're going to push the latest versions to you. Let's make sure that there's no negative impact on your line of business application usage. Let's run it for a couple of days. Okay, we know everything's good. Then we can go ahead and begin the scheduling and the update processes for the rest of the devices. Okay. I think that answered the question. Hopefully it did. And with that, because we're getting the time window here, if I can get my mouse over here, I covered this on the last one, but I want to cover this again just because I think this is a really cool feature, it's not even a feature actually, it's just something that one of our users brought to our attention, and I love the idea of it. So most of you probably already know what static profiles are. And like I said, we covered this the last time, but what I'd like to tell people is what you can do is you can create a static profile. And a static profile is, think of it as a reusable setting that you can use for whenever you want to use it. And I've created a connection that is a custom command. So rather than being Citrix or VMware, it's a custom command. And that custom command is set to this value. And I'll leave that if you guys want to grab a screenshot of it real quick. And then what I've also done is I've set it to use a custom icon. So I've given it a nice little icon, et cetera, all those things to make this connection look really cool. And then what I can do is anytime that I'm troubleshooting or working on a device and I need a console session to that device, I can now remote shadow from NoTouch Center. I can go into that specific device. In this case, I'll just pick this device. And then I can go to static profile, and I can assign the static profile terminal for debugging or assign it to that device, and then announce, and then suddenly I'm going to have quote unquote a putty session or a console session appear on that desktop. It's just kind of a cool, from a system admin perspective, the ability to suddenly put a console onto a device so that I can have a console session. And I just noticed that somebody asked, can we downgrade? Yes. Thank you for asking that question. That's the really nice thing about NoTouch Center, and NoTouch OS. To us, those updates are merely objects. So you can revert NoTouch Center as well as NoTouch OS. So if you happen to apply an update to NoTouch OS, your endpoint devices, and you discover that for whatever reason, something's not working, you can revert. Again, it's simply an object to us. So you can roll forward, you can roll backwards. We don't care. And the same thing with NoTouch Center. To a point, right? Obviously, you wouldn't want to go from a major build all the way back to another major build, right? But the incremental updates, you can absolutely, let's say 3.5.1 to 3.5.5 or 3.5.5 back to 3.5.4. Yeah, you can do those incremental changes and revert without any issues. Okay. So hopefully that helps. That's pretty much today's session. if we don't have any more questions, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Like I said, I think what we're going to do, the next one, the next tips and tricks, we'll probably target doing connections and extensions and how to use those and what those do. Okay. So with that, if there's no more questions, I hope everybody has a fantastic closing for this year. And thank you very much. Thanks for attending. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you so much, Rich. Any additional questions coming through, we will follow up with you after the call. Thank you so much for all these great questions and all your participation today. We will send out the recording shortly, and please have a great rest of your year. Thank you.